Get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid, the most amazing channel on the entire internet, the most amazing, phenomenal homesteading channel on the entire internet that has absolutely nothing to do with homesteading. So, for those of you who grew up in rural areas, out in the woods, out in the country, place like this, fall takes on a very special feeling. You know, the summer heat is gone. It's easier to be outside, more enjoyable to be outside. And if you've spent much time in the outdoors, like me, I mean, if I'm awake, and this goes back to childhood, if I'm awake, I'm outside playing, as long as it's not too unbearably hot, too unbearably cold. But when you gallivant around through the forests and the fields, you find things. Sometimes you'll find old perfume bottles from the turn of the last century. We have a stream over here that feeds into our pond, and I guess once upon a time, because our house is 120 years old now, and there were people living here for centuries before that even, but we've found Coca-Cola bottles made at the Coca-Cola bottling company in Charlottesville, down in town there, and that plant shut down in the 1920s. So just, you find a lot of, get my 6. You never know who or what you might see in the backdrop of these videos. Did you hear that? Rewind and listen if you didn't. This brings me to my point. A lot of times out here in these old woods, where there's been a lot of history, things are left behind that are not of physical, they're not physical in nature. They're spiritual. They're an energy. So with that said, I'm going to jump ahead a couple of weeks, and I'm going to read a story tonight just because I feel like telling a creepy old ghost tale. I'm going to read you a story from October Nights Part 2, 31 more tales till the Halloween season. I'm too excited to wait. You know, here we are. It feels like fall, and just it makes me reminiscent of growing up in Appalachian and squirrel hunting, deer hunting, just being out in the woods this time of year. And again, finding the old perfume bottles, finding the old stone chimneys from where there was a house from back in the pioneer days in the middle of what is now National Forest or grown over private property. But then also getting those eerie, creepy feelings of something that remains, that again is not physical. And I'm going to read us a story tonight called The Call That Never Came, that is reminiscent of one such event. True story from my youth. I hope you enjoy it. And again, listen to me, but watch back here. There's an odd occurrence that takes place in the living room of my home every winter. I don't know exactly what it is, and I don't know why it only happens during the winter, but that's just how it is. I will first describe exactly what this occurrence is, and it shan't take long, for it's quite simple, and then I will relay a true tale that this strange occurrence has brought back to mind, a tale of events that took place a quarter of a century ago as of this writing. I am an early riser. I wake each day, well, most days, at 5:30 a.m. I enjoy 45 minutes of solitude and over-caffeinated coffee before waking my wife up at 6:15 a.m. She's never been a coffee drinker, though I prepare her a hot cup each morning, and she sits lengthwise on the love seat and holds it and smells it a bit, and every now and then takes a sip or two, but never drinks it. And then I wake our son up at 6:30. Together, my wife and I see that our son is fed and dressed and ready for school, and then we put him on the bus at that end of our long driveway at 7 a.m., and then we sit around and miss him for the rest of the day. We actually work from home, and we get things that need to be done, but we do miss him the whole while that he's gone. And FYI, we're homeschooling this year for the first time. We love it because we don't have to send him off on that mean old nasty school. Well, they took the buses away from us anyway, but he was gone 10 hours a day. Now he's here getting his curriculum done in less time than he used to spend riding the bus, and we love it. We love it. We don't have to miss him all day. He gets to be here doing his thing while we're doing ours. It is during the time that I'm alone in the mornings before waking my wife, and again only during the winter months, that I witness this unexplained phenomenon. While I'm sitting on the couch sipping my hot coffee in front of a crackling fire in the wood stove, I can hear what sounds like the dial tone and sometimes light ringing of an old rotary phone, and it sounds as if it is coming from within the living room wall, halfway between where the wood stove sits in the corner of the room facing the front of the house. It took me some time to believe that I was hearing what I was hearing when it first started, and it took me some time after that to narrow down the exact location of the sound. More than half a dozen times each winter that we've lived in our house, this being the 6th winter, going on the 7th now if we stay here for the winter, I have stood beside the wall with my ear to it, listening to this strange sound. The wall can't be more than a foot thick before it reaches the outside of the house, certainly not wide enough for a hidden phone nook. Though phones were invented a quarter of a century before our house was built in 1903, our house was originally built as a sharecropper's house. Think financially challenged people. And I doubt its original residents ever had a phone. Again, this only happens in the winter, and I cannot even begin to explain any of it, but the story that this brings to mind, a story which relays actual events that I experienced firsthand, is as follows. I attended college at a small state school in the backwoods of some small town far, far, far from the interstate in West by God, Virginia. The school was a hot spot for first-generation college students like me and non-traditional students. Most of the faculty had graduated from this college, hence its merit is not worth mentioning because it has little, nor is its name worth mentioning, but it was a bona fide college nonetheless, and this is where our tale begins. I had a bit of an eccentric friend at this school. His name was Jim. Jim was both a first-generation college student like myself, and he was also a non-traditional student. Jim was in his mid-40s and having been half a dozen years too young to participate in the hoopla of the 1960s, he was a bit of an outcast when he'd done the whole hippie thing in the early 70s. After seeking meaningful causes to protest for 2 decades, his efforts all in vain, he decided in the mid-1990s, the time during which I was in college, and we knew each other, to go to college and get a degree and ease himself into the establishment for the purpose of earning a living. He'd actually gotten a haircut, too. Jim was eccentric, and this is what drew us together, as I, though a bit more straight-laced than Jim, have been accused many times of being eccentric myself. He'd be proud of my hair these days. We'd met while working together on the school's newspaper staff, and our friendship had formed instantly. Once, during the fall of the year, our second year at school, Jim invited me to accompany him to his family's old cabin and camp for the upcoming weekend. He told me his family owned about 100 acres of woodland in a neighboring county, and that they had an old log home that had stood for more than a century. Though big game such as deer or bear was not yet in season, squirrel, rabbit, and turkey were all in season, and he said we could spend the weekend hunting these small game animals and eating our take. He didn't have to twist my arm, as I would have been more than happy to accompany him anyway. Our small college was also known as a suitcase college, meaning most of the students went back home on the weekends, and I never did, which meant I usually spent the weekends alone. Jim's invitation was perfect. One of the things I remember about Jim's family's land is how remote it was. Once we turned off the main 2-lane highway and onto the first back road to reach the property, I soon knew that there was no way I could ever go back and find it again because there must have been nearly a dozen other turns we made onto other back roads, most of them unpaved, before reaching said property. I remember thinking if someone wanted to evade capture or hide bodies, this would be the place, but I knew Jim was harmless and I never felt as if I were in any danger. Upon reaching the old 2-story log home, I was greatly impressed. Sure, you could tell that the dwelling had been neglected in recent years, perhaps the entire last generation, but it had been built so well it had managed to stand the test of time regardless. Upon stepping into the old home, I noticed the walls had been constructed with old wormy chestnut lumber, much of it 2 feet in width, and Jim informed me the beams used for the framing had been solid hickory. In a word, this 2-story log home would stand another century easily and still look pretty much as it did the day I saw it back in the mid-1990s. Let's get our stuff moved in and get a bite to eat, and then we can go hunting, Jim said, laying one of his bags down on a dusty old couch in the living room. It's not that cold today, so we'll wait to build the fire after we come back in from the woods. Okay, I said, still surveying the downstairs. I felt like I'd stepped back in time by at least a century, and I remember being so happy I'd taken Jim up on his invitation. After moving all of our belongings into the cabin, Jim went upstairs and produced 2 20-gauge single-shot shotguns. He brought them downstairs, handed one to me, as well as about a dozen size 4-shot shotgun shells, and said, "Let's go," and we did. Jim took me up a trail that led to the top of the mountain above the cabin, about a half-mile hike, and he left me sitting beside a big oak tree. Its acorns falling so heavily it sounded like a hailstorm at times, and then he went further out to the end of the ridge to sit and wait for squirrels himself. Needless to say, with the mast falling as it was, neither of us had to wait long before bagging a few bushy-tailed squirrels. I got 3 and he got 4. And we were easily back to the cabin, squirrels skinned out and frying in the old cast iron skillet on top of an old wood stove in the kitchen, well before dark. I'd built a fire in the large stone fireplace in the living room while Jim had cooked our squirrels. He'd also fried up some potatoes and onions in a different pan on top of the old wood stove, and when we sat in the living room to eat in front of the fireplace just after nightfall, we ate like true hillbilly kings. Jim was just beginning to tell me about his family's history on the property when all of a sudden a phone rang. This phone was in the living room in which we'd been sitting, though I hadn't noticed that the phone was there. It was in a back corner off from the fireplace. Jim answered the phone, and I overheard him having a conversation that didn't sound so pleasant. "Well, this sucks," he said, coming back to the other side of the room after the call had ended. "What's up?" I asked. "That was my sister," Jim said. "In Ohio. Our aunt died, and I need to go out there tomorrow for the service. I guess she passed away about a week ago, but my sister wasn't able to reach me." This, of course, was back when cell phones were just a fantasy of the future, and since Jim lived off campus with no phone, there had been no way for his sister to reach him until he'd gone to the cabin for the weekend, which he usually did and which his sister knew. "How far away is it?" I asked. "Would you like me to go with you?" "No," Jim said. "No need for this to spoil your weekend. It's not far, maybe an hour and a half, just across the Ohio River past Parkersburg. I'll leave in the morning and be back early Sunday. We'll leave for school midday and still be back at school before dark." "You sure?" I asked. "I mean, I don't mind staying here alone. It's beautiful, but if you want company, I don't mind going." "No," Jim assured me again. "It's fine. My family isn't very large and we're all very private. Like to the point of paranoia of strangers. Just hang out here and enjoy yourself, and we'll have a redo of this weekend, maybe next weekend. Or even better, next month when deer season is in, if you'd like. There's some monster bucks up on this mountain." "Okay," I said, and it was settled. Jim and I stayed up as late as we could that night, which was only until about 10 p.m. I'll never cease to be amazed at how, when you're in a house with electricity and all the modern conveniences, which these days means speedy internet connection and flat-screen televisions, one can stay up half the night, often finding it hard to fall asleep. But when in a rustic setting, or especially in a tent in the woods, once the sun goes down, one begins fighting for life to keep their eyes open. It's a welcome experience I feel too many people don't get enough of. The next morning, Jim and I woke naturally around 7 a.m. It didn't take him long to scramble a pan full of eggs to go with our leftovers from the night before. After a quick breakfast, Jim was off to Ohio, and I was up on top of the mountain, 20-gauge shotgun in hand, looking for more squirrels. I certainly saw more that morning than I cared to shoot, as we still had leftovers from the night before, so I only harvested 2 more. I found that Jim had been right about the monster bucks. I had a 10-point with brow tines nearly a foot long walk within 20 yards of me. Since the wind was blowing toward me, he never smelled me, and since I never moved an inch, he passed within 15 yards of me, at his absolute closest, without noticing me. I couldn't wait to come back in November when deer season would be in and get a chance of harvesting him. I made my way back to Jim's log home around midday. I skinned out my 2 squirrels, refrigerated them in the ref that looked older than me. I would later find out that it was. And then I lay down on the couch and fell asleep. I was awakened by the sound of the phone ringing about half an hour later. I rose and I walked over to the phone in the dark corner of the room off from the fireplace, and I answered it. "Hello," I said, and all I heard was a dial tone. "That's odd," I said, hanging up, and then I heard it again. It was only then that I realized that the ringing sound was coming from another part of the house. I thought that I simply hadn't realized that there was another phone in the house, so I went looking for it. It sounded as if it were coming from just inside the back door, but when I made my way around the corner and into the hall, facing the back door directly, the ringing had stopped. I walked to the back door and I found that there was no phone. There was just a small closet that held a few jackets and a couple of pairs of old boots, but definitely no phone. I wrote the whole incident off to a dream and went back to the couch. Seeing that I could not fall back to sleep, I ate a bit, leftovers, and then I went back outside into the woods. Though I had my shotgun with me, I wasn't necessarily hunting. I've never killed more animals than I could eat, and our squirrel supply was full. Instead, I used my time, what remained of daylight hours that beautiful October afternoon, to simply stroll through the woods and take in the beauty. It was the peak of autumn and the leaves were in their full autumn glory. The scenery alone was just one of many reasons October has always been my favorite time of year. I got back to the log home and built a fire in the fireplace just before dark. After a hefty dinner of, you guessed it, leftover squirrel and potatoes and onions, I found myself drifting off to sleep even earlier than I had the night before, largely because Jim wasn't there to keep me awake with wonderful conversation. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by the sound of a phone ringing. This time, instead of rising and going immediately to the phone in the living room, I lay on my back listening. When the phone rang again, I could clearly tell that it was coming from the area of the back door. I'd laid a flashlight on the floor beside the couch where I was sleeping. I turned it on and headed for the sound of the phone. When I made the turn into the hallway this time, I shined my light to the end of the hall. The light was not too bright, as the batteries in the light were nearly dead. However, it was bright enough to vaguely cast a dim light onto the back door, and it appeared as if someone or something was standing in front of it. "Jim," I said, "is that you?" And just like that, what had been a dark figure in front of the door, nay, the shadow of a man cast upon the door by my light, but oddly, with no man in between my light and the door, to cast a shadow, being a more apt description, vanished, as if it had never been there at all, and the ringing of the phone ceased. Again, I wrote the whole experience off to a dream, and I returned to the couch, and I did not wake the rest of the night. The next day, I woke up around 7 a.m. I'd had my fill of squirrels for the weekend, so I ate only fried eggs with potatoes and onions. I went hiking afterward and didn't even take the shotgun. When I returned to the log home around noon, Jim was just returning from his trip to Ohio. "I brought pizza," he said, getting out of the car with a box from Little Caesars. "Praise God," I said. Hey, I love roughing it as much as anyone, but what college student is going to turn down pizza? As Jim and I ate pizza in the living room in front of the still burning embers of the fire I'd had the night before, and in the morning, he told me of his trip to Ohio. We discussed our trip back to college, and we were already making plans to come back in November to go deer hunting. Jim told me he'd also seen the big buck I'd seen the day before, and the competition was on as far as which one of us would bag it. "Had a couple of weird dreams while you were gone," I told Jim as our conversation began to lag. I told him what had happened with the strange ringing sounds of the phone and of the shadow, if that's what it was, that I believed I'd seen. "Wow," Jim said. "Wow what?" I asked. "Our family actually has two home places," he explained, "this one and the one in Ohio." Jim went on to explain about how his great-grandmother had actually left his great-grandfather roughly a century before. She'd fled from their home, this home, in the rolling hills of West Bygod, Virginia, and she had gone back to her family in rural Flat, Ohio. Jim's great-grandfather, it appears, suffered from bipolar disorder back before that or any other sort of mental illness or disorder was understood. Though Jim's great-grandmother loved her husband, she hated the continual feeling that the other shoe was about to drop. The man never harmed her physically, but when he would go through his manic phases, he would rant and rave, and he was completely miserable to be around. At times, he took to drinking, which made his mental illness even more unbearable. She would leave him and come back, Jim explained, over and over, and each time she left, she swore it would be the last, but it never was. It would just take her longer and longer each time to go back to him, but she did go back to him in time. Jim explained that though it was long ago, and though his family were rural people, his family did have means, at least by the standards of the era, and they'd actually been the first family to have a telephone installed in their home. It had been installed in a small phone closet by the back door of the house. Each time she left him, Jim explained, my great-grandfather would pace the hall, back by the phone, waiting for her to call. The last time she left, he got tired of waiting for the call that never came, and he took matters into his own hands. "What do you mean?" I asked, seeking clarification. "Well," he said, "she finally did call, but she got no answer. She called for days, and after getting no answer for days, she finally came back from Ohio. When she got here, she found him hanging from a tree out back, just outside the back door. She ended up going back to Ohio, and no one has lived in this house full-time since. We've just always used it as a hunting cabin, like you and I have done this weekend." Needless to say, I did not go back with Jim to hunt for deer in November. I did not go back to that old log home in the deep, dark woods of West Bygod, Virginia with Jim again, ever. The end. So, folks, I hope you like that tale. That's just one of 31 in October Nights Part 2, 31 more tales for the Halloween season. And yeah, you guessed it if you didn't know, it's Part 2 because there's also a Part 1, October Nights, 31 tales for the Halloween season. Both available in print or Kindle on Amazon, or you can get autographed copies from our Etsy store. The link to both places is in the description box below. And if you've got a creepy ghost story, something you or someone you know experienced, email it to us at the channel. The email address is crazylake@mail.com. Give us your permission to use it, and we will put it in the soon-to-be upcoming True Hauntings Volume 4, set to be released just before October. So, you know, on the day, I think that was the October 3rd story. On October 3rd, I'll come out and read you a story from the new True Hauntings volume. Okay, so October's on the way. The countdown is on for Halloween. See y'all for more next time here at the most amazing homesteading channel on the internet that has absolutely nothing to do with homesteading. Homesteading off the grid. Bye.